So what's the big deal about nepotism in church? Is it really that big of a deal, or are people just overreacting? How should Christians and churches respond to nepotism? We answered those questions and more in today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. And today's episode of the podcast is a very special episode for a few different reasons. First, today's episode marks 1 year of the Church Disrupted podcast. 1 year ago this week, we published the very first episode and wondered if anyone would listen. Would this resonate with people the way that we had hoped? Would it help people heal? And would it start much needed conversations in the Western Church? And the resounding answer to all of those questions was a huge yes. And we have been absolutely blown away by this community, your support, and the conversations we've gotten to be a part of in this past year. From the roundtable discussions with our regular rotating hosts to the guest interviews of the past 6 months, we could have never imagined the impact that this podcast was gonna have. So thank you. From the bottom of our heart, thank you for every listen, every supportive message and comment, and every time that you've pushed play. We are forever grateful for every single one of you. And that brings up the second reason that today's episode is so special. Today we have the return of one of our favorite guests who is going to return for a follow-up conversation from one of our May episodes of the podcast that sparked a lot of really good conversation and questions online. Best-selling author and creator of Raised to Stay, Natalie Runion, returns to the podcast today for what I hope is just the beginning of many future collaborative episodes between Raised to Stay and Church Disrupted. Now, a year ago, I would have never believed you if you said we would be interviewing guests with the influence, the reach, the impact, and the voice of people like Natalie Runion. Yet today, we've interviewed multiple guests like that, and Natalie has become someone that I consider a friend in ministry and a co-laborer in the fight for a pure and spotless bride of Christ. We talked about nepotism just a little bit in our last conversation, and it sparked quite a bit of conversation and maybe a little controversy online. So in today's episode, we're going to do a deep dive onto the subject of nepotism in the church, and I believe that it's a can't miss conversation. And the final reason why today's episode is so special is that we're just a few weeks away from starting to publicly launch and share SAI's fall projects. And guys, we cannot wait to share them with you. The work that the Spiritual Abuse Institute is doing, things like table groups, they've been fully funded for this fall. We've got other projects we're just as excited about, though, that we're still working to fund. It's going to be different research projects. Nepotism is going to be one that's included. We're going to launch our church-safe assessments to help build healthy church cultures. And we got a few surprise projects that we've not talked about at all that we think are going to bless all disruptors. We are incredibly excited, but we would love to ask for your prayers over the next 3 weeks as things really start to kick into high gear. And if our work has encouraged you or positively impacted you in any way, would you consider partnering with us financially? In August, we're looking to add and hoping to add 50 monthly donors of $15 or less. And while we love big donations, and we'll always take big donations, it's actually the smaller monthly gifts that help us most because they allow us to budget and plan for the future of this work. So if you would like to give a gift of any amount, you can visit spiritualabuse.institute and you can give there. But just as a reminder, we're not a church. This isn't a tithe. It's not a special gift to God that He's going to bless you for giving. These are simply gifts that if you want to give them, you're going to give them out of a heart for this work. You're going to give them because you've been impacted by this work, because you believe in it, because it's encouraged you. So we never want our ask for giving to be manipulative in any way. So regardless of whether you can give or whether you're supporting us in a myriad of other ways, We're grateful for you, no matter who you are or where you are. But will you join us for this very special podcast episode? And if you're ready, let's go ahead. Let's dive in together now for an honest conversation about nepotism in the church. All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast. And we got a special episode for you today. I'm back in the studio again with Natalie Runion of Raised to Stay. And we're doing another collaborative episode today. So welcome to the stayers who are with us. Welcome to the disruptors who are with us. And this is something that, as Natalie and I talk more, we're really hoping to be able to do more of these collaborative style episodes in the future. And as I say that, before we hit record, we don't always agree on these issues, but there's honor between us, there's respect between us, and we both have a heart for the church being the healthy, pure bride that we're supposed to be and called to be for Jesus. So I think these kind of conversations are super helpful. But today's conversation actually comes as a little bit of a response to questions that we got in our last conversation, Natalie. So we had a post, and I remember you sending me a DM on Instagram that night. You said, I hadn't even noticed it was going crazy yet. And you said, well, this one's getting some traction. And there was a little bit of disagreement. There was, a lot of resonation that it had with people. It's resonating with a ton of people. Others said, hey, we're not sure about this. And it was a post that talked about four things, but one of them was nepotism. So I'll give the four things that it talked about real quick, and then we'll just kind of talk about where this landed with you and why we decided to do this podcast. But the caption was 4 things we need to get rid of in the Western church. Okay, that was the part you saw before you had to click more or do anything else. And we ask in a poll, which one of these resonates with you the most, or which one do you think is the most dangerous? And the 4 things that you had talked about in that clip were nepotism, celebrity culture, competition between churches and pastors and leaders, and then wolves in sheep's clothing. And nepotism, celebrity culture, and wolves in sheep's clothing all got between 30 and 32%. So almost deadlocked at a third. Nepotism ended up coming in at 31% as the second one, but it was sandwiched in between 32 and 30. But nepotism is what we're talking about today, because there wasn't a lot of pushback of people saying, hey, actually, there's good to celebrity culture. There wasn't any pushback on, we really like our wolves in sheep's clothing. But there was some pushback on nepotism, and it came from a lot of good people in the trenches, pastors and leaders in the trenches who were doing good work, from some parishioners as well at good churches. So we wanted to talk about that because your responses and my responses were probably a little bit different. Do you remember that post and when we decided, hey, we should probably talk about doing an episode and kind of follow up on this?
I mean, it never fails that the post that we put out that we think will get some traction, we don't really know what we're going to hit on until we hit on something and everybody kind of lights up around it, which is beautiful because this is how we know what people want to talk about. This is how we know, oh, this is actually a really healthy dialogue that needs to be had. And that's based off the people that are listening. So I loved it. I felt like even though some people were misunderstanding the definition of nepotism, some people got offended before they actually thought through everything that we were saying. What it did is it broke my heart because it made me realize, wow, this is a bigger issue that is affecting the church than even I realized. Being a pastor's kid, being in the church my entire life, where generational families were basically taking the baton one after another, it never occurred to me that this was something that was such a huge issue for the current church. I mean, it's definitely one we have to watch out for, but this really broke my heart because I thought this is something that should be an honor to be able to pass our ministries on and do it in a healthy way. And yet there's so much misunderstanding and even unhealth in it. And so, yeah, I wasn't surprised once I started getting into the comment section.
Yeah. And my history is so different because, I didn't grow up in the church. My family members weren't pastors, so for me, the familial lineage thing has been weird since I saw it the first time, because my family history, I've had to do a lot of running from my family history to be reminded by good and godly people that I am not who my father is. I'm not who, came behind me. I'm not carrying their sin, that we can break generational curses. So, I I have been a little surprised by how many people push back on the nepotism thing. But as I looked at it and as I looked at the comments, I think, and I'll talk about this later, I'll share it with you, but I think I figured out kind of why. And there's a specific group that pushes against it, right? And they're not bad people, they're good people. But when you look at who pushes back against these conversations, like when you said, hey, we got to deal with nepotism, it is a certain group of people. And I think it's very telling of why it's only that group of people and it's not anyone else. And so it's a question I asked kind of with the business consulting background. It's a question that I would ask of like employers and stuff. And I just applied it to this. But one of the things that came up, and I was going to read a couple of comments that I think kind of really sparked this episode. Okay. Because we had hundreds of responses on that poll. We had more comments I think you or I could keep up with. So if we didn't reply to you on that post, I'm so sorry. It got out of hand that week. And that was not the only thing that we posted. We posted a lot of content. But one person said, I'm not going to say their usernames just in case they don't want to be put on the podcast, but one person said, as the daughter-in-law of current pastors who are stepping into the next season of our church's leadership and life, I would greatly appreciate a discussion on nepotism versus calling. My husband and I are stepping into something we did not ask for, but we know we're called to do and have been judged for it. So it's an interesting and often lonely place to be in. And I'd love to hear that podcast on this topic. So you did a great job of responding to her. There's a lot of pain in that for someone who's in this situation who says, hey, this isn't necessarily what we wanted, but it's what we felt was right. So that was one that I thought sparked this. Another person said nepotism is okay if the son following his father's footsteps is called to be a pastor in the same biblical pattern. 1 Timothy, Titus 2, with the church's blessing, right? And again, I told you, I sent you a message and said, Natalie, I'm gonna be a little quiet on those because I draw a really hard line and I don't want to just totally disengage people who are new to kind of my channel and what we do at Church Disrupted. Another person said, does family and ministry equal nepotism? This is a good question that I think we have to answer today, or at least give our thoughts on. Maybe we won't answer it for people because part of this is perspective. But isn't that just if special privileges are given? Wouldn't you agree that family callings are biblical and all throughout the Old Testament? I 100% agree that special favors should not be given or assumed, but I do believe families can be anointed to lead and shouldn't be completely condemned. I did respond to that one. Part of that may have been a trigger over the wouldn't you agree. I've just had questions phrased that way by narcissistic leaders for so long that that's a struggle, but I don't think it was meant in a bad way here at all. These are all good questions though. And they're questions that I think led us to this place. So as you kind of hear those comments again, you've seen them before, you've responded to all of them. As you hear them again, what's in your head and your heart as you're thinking about nepotism in the church and the tension it creates as we talk about it?
Well, first of all, we have to know what we're defining. And nepotism is not passing a baton. Nepotism is unearned favoritism that is passed down because of a person's last name or family tree, or maybe not even biological family, but just families that have been so enmeshed for generations that there is almost like this bond that is a soul tie, right? So now you've got multiple families, multiple people involved in this organization that's passing dysfunction down based off of last name, not based off calling. So obviously we're not talking about calling here. We're talking about dysfunctional ministry being passed from one unhealthy person to another unhealthy person simply because of a last name or because of a connection to a last name. And there are many definitions. We can go to the actual Webster dictionary if we want to, but that's different from calling. And as a pastor's kid, I do feel this, like being a pastor's kid is like being handed the family business that you didn't even want to begin with. And, I can remember being in college and everybody making the assumption that because my dad was a pastor, that I would become a pastor. And I fought against that with everything in my being, so much so that I spent 5 years at a public university majoring in exercise physiology and kinesiology because I didn't want favoritism. I didn't want a position given to me because of who my dad was. I didn't want my last name to resemble anything that could be good or bad. I wanted to make my own trail. And, for me, there was freedom in breaking out of that family business, if you would say that. But for others, there's pride connected to it. This is the family. This is what you will do. Husbands and dads have put so much emphasis on their sons that you will take this over and it will be your legacy. You will finish what we started. And now you've got a bunch of guys that don't even want the job, who are being given the job. And now they're unhealthy shepherds because they were forced into something that wasn't their calling. So when I hear people say we're obligated or we're supposed to, I kind of push back and say, you don't have to. Like, there's freedom. Like, you don't have to do it. But, I think a lot of churches that are passing just, this dysfunctional generational curse down has been out of obligation and not calling.
Yeah. And I, because of being a business consultant, I deal with this on the business side. I've walked through, even in the past 12 months, probably 3 separate father-son duos where it was expected by the father, the son is going to take over the business. I'm going to retire in a few years, help him do that. And then I would walk through with the sons and they would say, I hate this business, but I don't feel like I can tell him no. And my job was to help them process this and to come to the hard conversations together of a son telling a father, and at one point, a daughter telling a father, I don't feel like this is my next step. And I want your business to live beyond me. So I don't think a person should ever say, I can't be in ministry because my parent was in ministry, or I can't ever work at this church because my parent worked at this church. I don't think that's healthy. But I also think it's just as unhealthy and dysfunctional if we say, oh, I have to be in ministry because my family was, right? And, so for you, you share a similar calling as your father. You share that ministry calling, but it's yours because you broke out of it and it wasn't handed to you. For me, none of my family, were pastors. I actually had a prophetic word given by my grandmother, and everybody thought she was crazy literally the day I was born. That she said, I see him in ministry sharing the gospel in front of thousands. We all thought that was crazy until it happened, right? And I ran from it. I think calling is something you can't escape. Now, when it's given to you, it's a burden, okay? When it's given to you by anybody else but God, when God gives it to you, you can't escape it. And his yoke is easy, his burden is light. And even on the hardest days when you say, I wish I could go work at Home Depot or go do anything else, you can't. So that's what I would always tell people. As a youth pastor for so long, I would have students come to me and say, hey, I think I'm called to ministry. I'd have small group leaders. I think I'm called to ministry. And my answer always surprised them because I would say, okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is try to talk you out of it because it's terrible. And if you can do anything else, you should go do that. And they would be like, what do you mean? And I would say, well, if I could get out of ministry, I'd get out of ministry. I can't because that is my calling. And even when God did let me out of ministry, Natalie, it was moving to a different ministry just outside of the church. It was still for the church outside of the church. So when we're called, our family doesn't matter. It's the calling that matters. But it's the same thing when we're not called. Our family doesn't matter. It's the fact that we're not called to that. God has gifted us and called us to something else. And I think it was 12 Stone. I may have this wrong, but I believe it was 12 Stone with Kevin Myers, where he has a son on staff, and that's not the person who succeeded him. Instead, I think he's working in accounting because he said, that's my gift, right? So he's on staff in a lower level position, dealing with, like administrative type stuff. I don't think anybody would call that nepotism. But if his son had succeeded him at this huge, massive church, that would have potentially been nepotism. So how do we tell the difference so that we're not just calling everything nepotism, but we are being careful to stray from the appearance of nepotism?
One of the healthiest things I have seen done, number one, is having long succession plans. So it isn't just, it's a deal that my son's going to take this, no questions asked, but really giving the church about 5 to 8 years to prepare for the retirement of that senior pastor, be it that he's like the goat, like nobody wants anybody else but him. But giving that congregation, number one, a lot of time and input and voice into how they see the church moving forward. Second of all, asking everyone, whether they're family or not, to go through processes such as submitting resumes, going through interview processes with the pastor and the elders and the overseers, making sure that if it is your son who desperately wants this job, that they would have to go and get the job just like any other pastor that would be coming through a search committee. And they would have to go through all of the questions and they would have to go through a vote, and it would have to be something that the people were also saying, yes, we also want to say we see this in him. The elders, we see this in him. So that you're getting checks and balances across the board, that this wasn't just a good idea because it was the pastor's idea or because it was the pastor's son or daughter, but because this is who everybody's in agreement is the next one who's supposed to run with this baton and on mission. I think thirdly, having that person regularly involved in all aspects of the ministry. So if you are a child whose dad has been the senior pastor and you've been sitting back on your laurels for the last 15 years, just doing whatever you want, not helping, not serving, not being part of the people, and then all of a sudden you're being handed a pulpit, that's a major red flag. If you are in that position, you should know how finances work. You should know how hiring and firing works. You should understand HR. You should have your butt in a seminary. You should have it in business classes. You should look like you want it, not like you just earned it because of who your father is. So I'm looking for all of that when I walk into a church where I know succession is coming, is what is the level of entitlement in the one who's coming up behind. And if they're a servant, if they are part of the congregation, I love that. But I also want to see that they're going to be held to the same accountability and standard that any other candidate would be coming in for that job.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with all of that. I think probably for the person who is like the son or even the daughter, we talk about sons because that's more common, in churches today, and everybody listening has a different theology. So if your theology is, men only in ministry, that's not an argument we're looking to have on this podcast, right? But I want to make sure that we're speaking to people, who have different interpretations as well, because we're talking about nepotism as a whole right now. But even though I agree with everything, I would say, and I think this is probably where you and I differ, and probably not as much as even we may think, but I tend to draw bigger, bolder lines on things than most people. So I'm not saying you're wrong at all, Natalie, by drawing different lines, but I tend to go bigger and bolder because I have seen so deeply inside the damage that can be done when we flirt with those thin lines. So for me, I would say a son who's taking over doesn't need to just go through the same process as everyone else. I think they need to go through a harder process. And that sounds unfair, but no one has ever accused people of nepotism because the process was unfair in the harder direction, right? Because that's not what nepotism implies. So again, if it's between two candidates, they went through the same process and they're close, I think it needs to go to keep the church as above reproach as possible. I think it needs to go to the person who's not related, because we're all going to see that person we know in a different light. We want them to win. That's more familiar, right? But when the person is head and shoulders above everyone else, they're the right person. One thing you said that's huge and is important, the church has a vote in that. Even if your church governance structure doesn't say the church has a vote in that, ask them. It should be unanimous or nearly unanimous if you're going to go that route, because if not, it's going to sow seeds of discord that don't need to be there. So even though that's unfair, it doesn't preclude that person from other opportunities, because every other church in the country, every other church that you could go to in other countries where you speak the language and you could lead, you can lead there as well. So I only think it needs to be harder for them if they're taking over in the church where their dad, their mom, family members were. And again, I know that sounds hard, but when we go that direction, it removes the ability for people to say, hey, did you just get that because of your last name? No, actually, I had to be head and shoulders above the other candidates to even have a shot. How does that feel?
It feels right. And, we thought we were going to disagree a lot on this. And I think as you're talking, I'm like, we actually don't disagree all that much, because I think that part of the reason why dads do this or families do this is to regain some level of control even after they retire. They can still keep an office in the church. They can still have an opinion on how things are going, even if they move to Florida.
They can still get a salary.
Yeah, they can
in a lot of situations.
Salary. There are so many elements to keeping it in the family that benefits the family as a whole. That's a whole different podcast. Financially, all of that. That's what makes me feel unsettled when I see that there isn't heavy processes in place for the succeeding pastor, because it makes me think, why does that pastor still have an office in the church? Why does he still preach every, once a month? If he retired, you need to go. There's still a foot in the door. And that to me is a control issue. So nepotism is also really driven by control. that if it's your son that takes it, you have control because you have their ear. If it's a candidate that is brought in from a search committee that your people chose over your person, now you don't have a fight in that. You don't have a say in how anything goes. So for a lot of this nepotism talk, it's because senior pastors who are retiring aren't actually retiring. They're just doing the ministry through their son or daughter who's acting as a puppet in some ways.
Yeah, they're living vicariously through them, and the true transition happens a lot of times, not all the times, but the true transition happens when the patriarch dies, right? But then a lot of, and again, this isn't all cases, but in a lot of cases, the reasoning behind, right, the fuel behind why the son transitioned is now gone. Because often I've seen that with men of God who I love and care about, but they're still just trying to prove to their dad that they're worthy, right? And as someone with father wounds, I totally get that. That's a bad reason to be in ministry, though, because at some point you can't prove to your father that you're worthy. And I've been in churches. Again, the church I'm described now was a pretty good church. They were pretty healthy for my family. But senior pastor gave it to his son. The church was behind it, seemingly healthy transition. But there were still times to where it was like, hey, we're going to go this direction. And then all of a sudden it was, we're not going that direction. And if you talk to, staff members or people in the know, hey, what happened? Well, the dad, the patriarch, came in the office and he did not like that. So we moved on. I've seen another church where just this year, they laid off staff members, longtime staff members, because giving was down. They laid them off. They lost their jobs, had to uproot their families, while at the same time, the patriarch who had retired was still receiving the same salary, right? Those kind of things are a little bothersome to me. Hey, Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. But I want to talk about what nepotism is. And, this is a place where just the differences in personality are kind of funny. I'm a little bit more of I'm an Enneagram 3, but I've got a lot of 1 in me. So I like to nerd out on definitions, and you're very much so a creative person. I have no idea about your Enneagram. I just know you're way more creative than I am. So it's like, hey, this is kind of what it is. And then I'm like, well, but there's so many definitions of what it is. So I want to talk about, if we can for a minute, nerd out on the definitions and the etymology of the word. Like, I'm a big, especially with Greek and Hebrew, where did these words come from? What did they mean? How have they changed? Because we can read scripture specifically, and if we're reading it the way that we understand these words today, we are in trouble, right? So I want to look at where it came from, but also where it is in our culture. So most people didn't know this. You may know this because you may know this outside of me. I think I may have said it before, but did you know that nepotism was actually a word created to describe malfeasance in the church?
Oh, no, I did not.
Most people don't. Nepotism is actually a word that was created in the 16th century. Mid-16th century is when we have the first uses of it, and it was used in Italy and in France, but it comes from the Italian word nepote, which means nephew, and it was coined to describe the favoritism and unfair privileges that were given to nephews and illegitimate children of popes and bishops, because they were installing these nephews and illegitimate sons in places of power and places of influence within the church that they didn't belong. And of course, at that time, church and state was very entangled as well. So the word nepotism literally was designed and created to describe a problem in the church. Anytime I see that, I want to say as the church, we need to distance ourselves from that word as much as possible. Yet most of us don't know as we take up for, well, but think of all the times it's right. We forget or we never knew it was literally designed to describe us. And now it can describe politicians and other businesses. And if you're an NBA basketball fan, potentially NBA basketball. That's been a big topic of discussion, lately. But that throws a lot of people off when they hear that's where it came from. And when I heard that's where it came from, I said, oh, that makes sense why this bothers me so much, because I never knew why it bothered me so much. Here are a couple of definitions. We'll nerd out on those for just a second. We'll get past it. So those of you that hate when I read definitions, just fast forward. We'll get through it. Okay. But I want to give you the Oxford definition, the Webster's, and the Cambridge, because when we look at all of them, I think we get a really holistic view of what this means. The Oxford definition, the Oxford Dictionary, if I can speak, says that nepotism is the practice of those with power or influence of favoring relatives, friends, or associates, especially by giving them jobs. Okay. So we'll come back. I want to focus on influence here in a minute because I think that's important. Influence is very important, something we don't talk about enough. Webster's just says it's favoritism based on kinship, usually professionally. And then the Cambridge Dictionary says that nepotism is the act of using power or influence. Again, there's influence to get good jobs or unfair advantages for members of one's family. So I really would want to focus on, I think, two pieces we don't talk about enough with nepotism when defining it. It's influence and unfair advantages. And I think when we bring those into the fold, it's more than just, hey, were you qualified for the job? It brings up other questions. It's, even if you're qualified for the job, are we sure you didn't inadvertently get unfair advantages because the people of the church love your father, because they love your family, because they've grown up seeing you, right? It's really hard to know. Are you sure there was no influence on the process because of how much people loved your family? And I think that's where the struggle of above reproach comes in, because it's really hard for us to even know, which is why I would really fight for, if a son is going to take over from a father, it really needs to be head and shoulders above any other candidate. Everybody's in agreement. And that you followed a hiring process that you had and had used before that transition happened. Mm-hmm. Okay. They went through the same hiring process everybody else does. They answered the questions based on the job description. They were head and shoulders above everybody else's. Does anything surprise you about those definitions as I read them? I told you what stuck out to me, but does anything surprise you or stick out to you that you hadn't thought of?
I mean, it all together, it makes so much sense when you see the tension and why churches don't do well that aren't truly seeking the Lord on who should come up behind them. If this is the origin of the word itself, kind of gives us an idea that this isn't a good idea. This probably isn't going to work. It's hard being a pastor's kid because I know a lot of us would say, well, we don't want favoritism. I can remember being in youth group and I was treated so differently because everybody thought, because I was the pastor's kid, that all their moms wanted their daughters to be like me. And everybody, I was the star student because this is how we should act. And the weight of being a pastor's kid alone should really disqualify us from stepping into our father's shoes. And I want to be very careful how I say that, because being a pastor's kid alone is traumatizing enough without the expectation of, now I have to pastor the very people who at one time probably weren't saying very kind things about me and my family, or watched me go through puberty, or watched me, go through my sinful years or whatever. And so now they're seeing me through a lens of not just my father's daughter or my father's or son, but now they're looking at me through this lens of like, I'm almost still a kid. I'm never going to grow up in their eyes. So it takes a full generation of people, which surprisingly, church people live a very long time. Okay. Like church people don't die quickly. Okay. Like there's still people in their 90s who remember your papaw. So it's like, you're now in a situation where you can't win. Because even if you take it over and 90% of the congregation is blessing it, the 10% that don't bless it are a very loud 10%. And now I'm not just carrying the weight of a pastor's kid or the loss of my father if he passed. Now I'm carrying the weight of being a shepherd of a church who I think wants me, but I'm not quite sure because they've been stuck with me since I was 5. So I'm coming at this more from like, I feel why that's hard for pastors' kids, because we want to carry on the legacy, but I don't think people know how heavy it is to even be a pastor's kid, much less to take on that role. So I don't know if that answers the question. I think I'm shocked that so many of us would say yes to continuing on
Yeah.
in that environment.
Hmm. Well, I think it's the desire, and again, there's so many father wounds here. It's the desire of honoring our fathers, wanting our fathers to be proud of us, wanting them to love us, right? If you have a father wound at all, you are going to have a hard time saying no to that. Okay. And a lot of PKs, pastors' kids, have father wounds, right? And I told my kids from early on, just because I'm a pastor does not mean I want you to become a pastor. And unless God calls you to it, my hope and prayer is that you do something else. Do not do this just because I did. But again, that when we change, and I tell business clients this all the time, change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. And until the pain of staying the same is greater, we're not going to change, right? So we carry that trauma, that burden, that heaviness in because the greater pain is I want to please my father, right? But I agree. I think it's incredibly unfair. And I remember, there's a church I was close to that's getting ready to make a transition. They were going through a 3 to 4 year transition, thought that was long, giving it to a son. And about 3/4 of the way through, halfway through, some elders started having some concerns, but they couldn't tell the son. That would have crushed him, right? So these elders are having this concern. The fact that I know tells me they were telling other people, which now is going to hurt his ability to lead now that he's the pastor. But the concern was we did this too quick. We should have asked him to go to another church and succeed and lead well before we ask him to come back. And I thought, you should have. Their answer, though, was, you're right. We agree on that, but we're already too far in. And I think when stuff like that happens now for that person, it's unfair. People have questioned their leadership before they ever stepped in. And again, so I tell people, if you're going to have a transition familially, make sure that person has done ministry in multiple other places well. They've got a track record of being above reproach, because otherwise, if they only know your system and where your family has thrived, it is unfair to them. And I think that's the only way they can come back in and be head and shoulders above where they were. So let's talk about the biblical notions of this, though, because there's a lot of biblical pushback. And some of the biblical pushback is, things like, hey, wouldn't you agree that in the Bible, some leaders passed down to their sons? Look at David. He passed down to Solomon. I always find it intriguing, and we'll get into this here in just a minute, but I always find it intriguing that people use the example of David to Solomon, but they don't use the example of Solomon to Rehoboam, because that doesn't prove the point, right? When you look at all of the kings, it's roughly a 50% success rate on whether familial transition worked. We wouldn't accept that on any sort of surgery, or gambling odds. We'd say we want better odds than that. But let's look at God's design scripturally and just push back, ask questions if there's any place you think I'm getting it wrong, because I know scripture. But when I look at it, I look back at the nation of Israel when it was first established, not when God gave the promise to Abraham, because that was going to be built out of his seed, built out of a family. The 12 tribes were built out of a family. I've heard people use that before. But when God established them as a nation, leadership was given to Moses. Okay. And Moses was not, any sort of like direct son of Joseph, right? He wasn't a direct son of one, he was in the line like everybody else was in the line. When Moses transitioned power, though, Moses had 2 sons. According to scripture, his 2 sons were Gershom and Eliezer, right? Moses did not give power, and God did not ask him to give power to his sons. He asked him to transition power to Joshua, who was not related to him. And that was who had been groomed to be able to take that. Okay. After Joshua, we had the judges. The judges were not passed down to family members to be leaders of the nation. I think one time that may have happened. I'd have to look back at it, but I think Deborah may have taken over from her husband. But that was not the rule. Okay. That was the exception. Then what happened? Why did we move away from the judges and a theocracy? Israel did that because they begged and clamored for a king when God said that's not the plan. Kings were not the plan. Kings were a concession. Okay. But think about when we do transitions of power today, a lot of times it's the father anointed and appointed the person and said, we're going to do a multi-year transition, but I think this is who you should go with, right? Also, and I've seen this come up in some different comments in different places, but the only biblical response that we can generally give, or the one that's given the most to nepotistic succession and familial succession, are the kings, right? But pastors are very different from kings. And the moment we start seeing pastors as kings, we've got bigger problems, right? Not only that, but again, kings were not the plan, right? So we can't be anointed and appointed like that. It's got to be something that God has called us to, and everyone sees it. There is no question, right? So I think the best case for familial succession is the kings. That was about half and half, like I said, caused a lot of major damage. It never worked well long-term, Natalie. Never. We see every few generations it would come back to evil. And again, that wasn't God's plan. It was a concession. So do you see anything I'm missing biblically that would say, hey, no, we need to look at familial succession more? Because when I look at scripture as a whole, I don't see a lot of pros for it as much as I see a lot more cons for it, that we need to be very careful and know that God has called these people.
I mean, the whole thing that you just said about how pastors are not kings, right? I think we forget that. Pastors are shepherds. Shepherds work. Shepherds are in the uncomfortable places. Shepherds are not sitting in their upper chamber of the church, letting their, little meon people do their work for them and, do their bidding for them. That's why I always tell staff people, don't be a holy henchman. Don't participate in activity where your pastor is acting as king and demanding that you go do the firing, you go do the hard conversations. Like, we need to make sure we're not putting our pastors in king positions. And we do it because they allow us to, or they demand it, which I think is something that is...
To question them is to dishonor them. And we have a culture of honor here. That twists biblical honor in a really dangerous way.
It does, because it makes us feel guilty for questioning our discernment when there is somebody out of order. And I just tell people all the time, like, if you're feeling that discernment, you could be honoring and honest at the same time. So I think that's a fascinating, distinguishing comment that you made, that pastors are not kings. Second of all, I love what God said to Joshua. He looks at Joshua and he's like, look, Moses is dead. He just lays it out there. Like, Moses, he's not coming back. He's not here. And yet there is still a mission that needs to be met. And I'm going to appoint you to do it. And you had Moses. You don't have Moses anymore. But think of all the ways you aided Moses over the last several years. And this is what I love about that relationship, is that before God gave Joshua all that responsibility, he was an aid to Moses. And, being a son and a daughter, it's hard to be an aid to your parent. Am I an aid to my parents now because they live with us and they're older and we're in a different relationship because my dad's not pastoring? Sure, I want to be an aid to my parents. But usually in the succession part of passing a church off, your kids aren't your aid. They haven't been doing the hard work of shepherding with you. They've been benefiting from whatever it is that you were doing as a king. And so I think your king...
And if anything, they had to be protected from it. Because when
Yes.
I was in ministry, if I told my kids and my wife everything that I went through and everything that someone said to me, they couldn't worship there because they would struggle with the people they saw. I had to be able to take things and not share them with my wife or my kids so that they could still have good relationships with people.
Absolutely. And most of the consult calls I'm doing with executive staff who are now aiding the new pastor who was the pastor's son, or aiding a daughter who stepped into a higher position, the conversation has been, we loved working for their dad, but they do not know all the things that their dad was doing. And so now they're in this position and we're all now forced to support someone who actually had no idea the day-to-day things that their father was doing. They only were getting the Cliff Notes version. And now they're sitting in an office and they're getting all of these litany of complaints and finances. And the staff is suffering because they got the pastor's kid, they didn't get the pastor. And that's what we have to remember. Staff will also really be impacted by a succession that does not go biblically or with good timing. And so you can lose entire church staff over a nepotistic move like this.
Well, and I think about the way that we describe pastors and the way that we describe executive pastors, which I hate those titles. I understand why we use them. As a church consultant, I'll use them, but I hate them. When we look at the New Testament model for a church, there wasn't a CEO leader in charge. There was a plurality of elders, and being a pastor didn't make you an elder. That was a role in the fivefold. You cared for people. It's what you did. Being a teacher didn't make you an elder, although you could be a teaching elder. You could be a ruling elder. So one, in today's modern American church, we're ripe for this because we have set up a CEO model of ministry. Even in small churches, there is one person kind of at the top calling the shots, and then they have to answer to a board, to elders, to deacons, however you want to say that. But think about how we talk about in church circles, especially in like church leadership and consulting circles. We talk about executive pastors as the second chair. I remember when I went to the last megachurch that I worked at, I read books before I started called Leading from the Second Chair, because I was a second to the person who was going to become the senior pastor. Okay. So we had to learn how to lead from the second chair. There's things you don't say when you're in the second chair. Okay. Nathan was very brave when talking to David. He had to set all that up because he could have lost his head for calling out David. Okay. So he had to go through this elaborate thing, where he brought David to this self-realization instead of just going, David, what are you doing? Right. There's not supposed to be a second chair. It's just a different chair. And every chair gets to respond. I think about church discipline when Jesus talked about it, which is its own thing, Natalie. When I look at church discipline, we talk about it as church discipline. Jesus said, bring it before the ecclesia, before the gathering. There was no church at that point. So it was really just how we handle conflicts between people, between brothers and sisters. It wasn't really church discipline. That's more found in like Titus and Timothy. Mm-hmm. But if you look at what we call church discipline, at the end of Matthew 18, the church discipline process is where you have, if two or more are gathered in my name, I'm there with them. And just about a week or so ago, that was the verse of the day on the Bible app. And I got so frustrated because it's so out of context. And we think, hey, if we're gathered together, the Lord is with us. When the reality is, no, the Holy Spirit's inside of you. He is with you when there is one. The context of where two or more are gathered together, I'm there with them, is if any two in the body will witness with another. So it looks like three because it's you and two witnesses. If there are three people who say this is a problem, the Holy Spirit is in the midst of saying, yes, we need to talk about this. Yeah. Those people may not be exactly right, but there is something we need to talk about here. Mm-hmm. This is no longer above reproach. Even though it may not be the reproach they're bringing, it's not above reproach, which means it only takes three people in any body to be able to say, we've got to fix something. There is an issue, even if it's just pain, that we need to hear and say, we're so sorry. That was never the intention. How can we help you heal? We've lost that ability when there are chairs and CEO models and people are over another person. So for executive pastors in those situations, and also for if you're listening to this podcast and you may be frustrated because you'd say, I took over after my father. One of the things that I would ask you to do if you're in that pastoral position is allow your executive pastors to sit in parallel chairs. Yeah. You have a responsibility that's different than them, but allow them to push back on you and disagree with you. Go back to Rehoboam. If Rehoboam had listened to his father's advisors and they said, hey, your father was a good man, but he was a hard man. And if you would lighten the load, lighten the taxes, these people will follow you for forever. Well, he didn't listen to what he didn't know, and he lost the kingdom in an instant. So I think there's so much there of being able to say the farther we move away from the CEO model of one person being in charge, the more we allow everyone in the body to begin to be able to speak into the body. We deal with things long before they become abuse. We deal with things when they're just church hurt. And even when it's church hurt and the person maybe is more hurt than they should be, that's still a sheep we're called to care for. It's a brother or sister. So when we do that, man, we're so concerned with loving one another and out submitting one another, which is most of the New Testament. It's love one another. It's love one another. It's serve one another. It's what we call the one another's. If we get back to that, we never make it to spiritual abuse because we're so concerned about one another, even in our hurt. And we all have the authority that God has given us to say, this doesn't feel right. Yes. What do you think? How does that resonate with you? Am I on the wrong track?
No, even the New Testament, when we look in Acts chapter 2, most people talk about the second chapter of Acts as this moment where the Holy Spirit fills a room and everybody starts speaking in tongues and everybody gets excited about that part. But we forget that there was also a lot of people that were skeptics in the room who were like, they're drunk on wine and this isn't real. And I love how in the Message translation, Eugene Peterson writes that Peter stands up right now. Jesus didn't look at the disciples in the upper room and say, you're going to be executive pastor John, and you, Peter, because you denied me, you're going to be the janitor. And because you did this, Jesus wasn't giving jobs. He just said, I need you to go and take the gospel to the far ends of the earth. And I'm going to leave you my Holy Spirit to do it. That was basically kind of like a peace out moment for Jesus, leaving the disciples. And then you get to Acts chapter 2, the presence of the Holy Spirit fills the room. And it's all great until you've got a bunch of people that are saying, whoa, wait a minute. I know you guys are amazed by this. I know you guys are in awe of this, but we're actually kind of like not sure this is like what we want to be part of. And it says that Peter stands up, and this is how Eugene Peterson says it, that he stands up with the backing of the other 11. The disciples understood the assignment, that if one of them was going to stand up and defend health and culture and the Jesus movement, not just like what we all know as like the church, but the actual mission of the Great Commission, that it was going to take all 12 of them in agreement to say, you're right. We remember reading this from the prophet Joel, that in the last days, the Holy Spirit is going to fall, and that, man and woman are going to prophesy. That's what Peter does. He stands up, but he doesn't go alone. He has the backing of the other 11. And I think the CEO model, it silences the other 11 and says, nope, I'm it. I'm the one. I have all the answers. And you're silencing the others who have also been called to the same mission and same house.
And I think unintentionally, there's a lot of that silencing that goes on. I know there were times where I didn't speak up about things I saw because, well, I don't have the authority. And I look back on it now and I think I had more authority than 90% of the people at that church. 90% of the staff at that church. So if I didn't feel like I had enough authority, why would the others feel like they had enough authority? And going back to nepotism, again, at this specific church, and not trying to throw shade at them at all, they were doing what they thought was right. I have no question they loved Jesus. But if I was on the executive team, I realized I wouldn't have any more authority because the executive team had 4 members of the same family on it.
Yeah.
They were the majority. There was an automatic win built in. And I remember them talking often. They would say this from the stage, preaching on the weekend. When you go home, you're not thinking about church anymore. When we go home, family dinner, we're talking about you. That's what we're doing. Family dinner on Sundays when everybody's together, we're talking about you. And it sounded good on the surface. And then I realized, oh my goodness, if you're not in the family, if you're not family dinner, then you don't want to be a negative topic of discussion. You can't advocate for yourself, right? And that's where nepotism goes wrong. I don't think they ever meant for it to go wrong that way, but we're all on the executive team together. We're having family dinner. Well, now the power dynamic has shifted. A couple of things I wanted to mention. These are just notes that I had, and I know we don't have a ton of time left, so just cut in though at any point that you feel like I'm missing it or you feel like something needs to be said. The church is not a family business. Mm-mm. We treat it like one. But it's not ours to give. The position of pastor and any sort of ministry, church leader, elder, that is given by the Lord. It's not given by us. So I think the church has to be bigger than any family. And often when we talk about nepotism, even in that first, that clip from that first episode where we were talking about it, you were talking about nepotism as it can't be one family in charge anymore, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. But it's also a disservice to the church outside of that. It's a disservice to the family, but it's a disservice to the church because the average lifespan, and again, this is the business consultant coach side of me, the average lifespan of a family-owned business is 24 years. I think most of us would say a church should last more than 24 years. Only 40% of family businesses make it to the second generation. That's not good odds. Only 13% transition to a third generation, and only 3% make it to a fourth generation. And they are family-owned businesses from day one. From day one, that was the plan. I'm trying to create this wealth for my family. But the other things that I look at, and this is where I always come back to when I'm drawing a big, bold line and where people often say, Jeff, I think you're too hard on that. Here's why. And I'm okay being too hard on it. The 2 main requirements that I see in Scripture for church elders, church overseers, church leaders of any kind, when I look at that list, there's 2 that stand out. One is the first, to be above reproach, which means irreproachable. Any reproach will fall on deaf ears because everyone will say, no, here are the facts. The facts are easy to bring out. The other one is to have a good reputation with outsiders, because those 2, they're hard, but they're real black and white, okay? Neither is easy to do with the appearance of nepotism. And I'm not saying nepotism for a reason. I'm saying with the appearance of it. Mm-hmm. If there's the appearance of it at all in our church, we're no longer fully above reproach, and it invites a poor reputation with outsiders. Now, there are ways to do it, but it's really, really hard. And the moment that we're not above reproach and we don't have a good reputation with outsiders, we're actually no longer qualified until we fix it. So that's why it's so important that if we are going to pass the baton, has that person done well in other places? Have they served in other places? Was the board, the church, the pastor, was everybody behind it? And were they head and shoulders above everyone else in the hiring process so that it makes sense and there was no question? If there were 3 candidates at the end, would the church, whether they have a vote or not, would they have voted on any other candidates? Is there any concern? Because if you're going to have people that don't agree, have them disagree on someone who's not that pastor, right? So that's what I look at. And that's why I draw such a bold, hard line on nepotism in churches, Natalie, is because we've got to be above reproach. We've got to have a good reputation with outsiders. And those are the 2 things that always fall by the wayside in small places before spiritual abuse pops up. Okay. And when I say spiritual abuse, I'm including not just emotional abuse and abuse of power. I'm including sexual abuse. I'm including physical abuse. I'm including all of those things because any kind of abuse in a spiritual setting is spiritual abuse. Well, when we see things like the Robert Morris situation, or we see things, there's things that pop up all the time. I could go through and give a list of these. There was always small places that people thought weren't a big deal where they were no longer above reproach and they stopped having a good reputation with outsiders. Plagiarism's become a big one that we talk about often. And I've had pastors on the podcast disagree with me vehemently that plagiarism doesn't apply to pastors, which literally boggles my mind because I told one not too long ago, I said, if you're willing to cross that line and justify plagiarism and no longer be above reproach, then eventually you're going to be willing to cross another line. This is a dangerous, slippery slope. So for me, that's why I say we've got to do everything within our power. And because we should make it so hard so that we're above reproach and have a good reputation with outsiders, it should be difficult and the exception, not the rule, when a church actually can do this in a way that is above reproach. So I don't think nepotism, I don't think a person taking over for a family member is always nepotism. But I do think 98% of the time it can have the appearance. And if we can't get rid of the appearance, you're better off to operate in that calling somewhere else. Yeah. So that you can be above reproach and have a good reputation with outsiders. So that was kind of my final words. I'd love to hear your final words, your thoughts on kind of the subject.
Well, the whole, looking good to the outsiders, it goes back to Acts where, Luke writes that those looking inside generally liked what they saw. That's the Message translation, that those who were looking in at what was happening in the early church genuinely liked what they saw. And I think that when we are walking fine lines like nepotism, it can already taint a person's view of what they're expecting when they get inside, because they have their own biases. They have their own understandings of a church that's been around 50 years and the last name of the pastor hasn't changed for 50 years. They already kind of have that. So we're already kind of like one mark against ourselves if that pastor had a bad reputation, all of that. That aside, I know that there are a lot of pastors' kids listening to this, a lot of pastors who got their churches from their uncles or from their grandfathers or whatever. And I want to say to you, you're not bad. This isn't a conversation to guilt you into thinking that you were given something that you didn't work hard for. This conversation is for all of us to check our hearts and to say, am I in the right space? Am I called to this? Or was I just given this? Am I operating out of entitlement, assuming that I'm going to be given something because of my last name? And you talked about influence earlier. We can go beyond the church walls as just Christian content creators who have large platforms simply by who their dads are or who by their parents are. If they had reality TV shows and now the kids are famous, like we can't control who gets influence in our world, but we can control what kind of churches we are attending and know if we're in a healthy spot or not. And so pastors' kids, if you want your dad's church, if you're like, man, I am called to this, I know that I'm supposed to be in this position, then you need to get on your knees, start interceding for that church, because you already know how hard it is to be a pastor's kid. It's going to be even more hard to pastor the very people who watched you grow up. So start interceding now. Get the education that you need. Start taking the business classes. Start proving to your congregation that you're not the kid that they were babysitting, but that you are now going to step in and be a shepherd, and that you will do even greater things than your father did based off of the lessons that you've learned as a family, the ways that he has fallen, and that you've acknowledged that you're willing to live above reproach, that you're willing to put elders and leaders around you who aren't going to let you act like the spoiled king's prince, but make you be that shepherd that God's called you to be. So this isn't slapping the hand of those of you who have taken the church from your parents. It's saying, step up to the plate. If you're called to it, then do it with truth, humility, and love as Jesus did, and shepherd the people. Don't just king over them. Don't just lord over them. And if you're not the right person, tell your father now. Tell your mother now. I am not the right person, but I will be praying and interceding for the person who is. I would love to help you on that. I'll clean toilets. I just know I'm not called to shepherd. Start that conversation now. And finally, pastors, if your succession plan is 5 years out, 10 years out, stop telling the congregation that your child is going to be the one who's going to take over for you. First of all, it's too soon. Second of all, you don't know that. Anything can happen in 5 to 10 years. You're creating unneeded chaos by making people look to somebody who's not ready yet to take it. And you're also making assumptions that in 10 years, God is still going to want your child to take over that pulpit. Be prophetic in speaking to what the word says about your church, what the word is saying about your people, what the Lord says about your people. And then when it's time for you to make that succession plan, you haven't already made promises to your child and to your church, something that can't be fulfilled. And so just, again, timing, maturity, all of that, biblical wisdom, discernment, we just need to be very careful that we're not hurting our children and hurting our congregations trying to create something that God didn't want or intend.
And it's so good. It's also a reminder too, you may be called to shepherd and pastor a church, but it may not be that church. And that's okay. Mm-hmm. And if you are, you're a pastor, you've taken over for your father, we're not asking you to leave. I even drawn a big bold line. I'm not asking you to leave and say you didn't deserve it. I'm asking you to do your best to operate above reproach in it, and to listen well in it. But we're also talking to a lot of people to say, hey, if you haven't already done this, this is really hard to get right. And it's really hard on everybody. So if those kids are called to pastor, it may be the best thing for everyone to let them pastor someone else. So it's just starting the conversation, because it's just so easy to say, well, who's going to take over? It must be my son. And here's how I'd love to end. And again, I'll just ask, we won't be able to talk about it at a time, but I'll ask if you've seen anything different, because maybe you have. But the only people that I see and hear push back against nepotism in the church and say, hey, but it's not always bad, it can be good, because that's not a first response for most people. And again, those comments all came from, I think, really good people. But the one thing they had in common was pretty much all of them were either people who had been positively affected by a transition, or they were in a church that had had a transition like that. And we always want to justify and protect what we're a part of. I have never heard someone outside of a church, and I've definitely never heard an unbeliever go, yeah, I'm pro nepotism. Don't be so hard on nepotism. And again, it's because it affects our reputation. It affects us being above reproach. And so I think that's something we've always got to ask. And it's something I try to ask is, are we hearing this pushback on a topic from a lot of different people, or from a subset that is benefiting from it? And anytime, if that's where we're hearing the pushback from, it's just something where we have to pull back the curtains a little bit and go, hey, why is that? We understand where you're coming from. We don't want to hurt you, but there's a reason why you probably feel that way. So,
and I would also encourage those of you who are saying that because it's the only church you've grown up in. It's the only pastor you've ever had. It's the only denomination you've ever known. To get out into the world and to visit other churches, to sit under different shepherds, not podcasts, not listening online, but go and sit in physical buildings and see what churches are doing outside of your state, outside of your city, outside of your country. And you'll realize that if you've grown up in the same church your whole life, you have a very one-dimensional echo chamber around you. And what you think is healthy might actually be abusive. And what you think is normal might not be normal. And so I think that our comfort can be kryptonite in that we are unable to understand that there are people being hurt by things like nepotism. There are churches that are failing because of lack of accountability. And so make your experience with Jesus and the church three-dimensional. Get out there, see what's going on, read books, be part of the church, not just your congregation, but get out there and be part of the church. And you'll see why our hearts break for some